The patriots amongst the high command suffered deeply as they watched the Tsar make fatal mistakes whilst the danger grew and came ever closer. They held mistaken views, but they believed in them sincerely. They contemplated the possibility of a revolution from within the palace to be effected by means of a bloodless coup d'etat. This quote was written in the early 1920s, about early 1917, by a decorated general of the Imperial Russian Army, although it could very easily have also been said in the last week. Today is June 27th, 2023, and it's very important that I tell you the date, because it's been less than a week since something took place which legitimately shook the entire world. Now, From Sarajevo to Red Africa is a history production company, and our podcasts and movies and History She Wrote series have to do with history. So I will not be discussing this current incident that dare not speak its name. There are far more qualified folks to get to the minute current analysis from, and we can recommend several from our recent documentary, The Glorious, about the history of the Slavs who can help you, who are both fully plugged in and trustworthy. However, our business is history, and none of this happened in a vacuum. So again, without getting into the current incident that dare not speak its name, let's talk about a rebellion against the government of Russia in the past that had extensive repercussions on the Balkans, on the Third World, and on the world as a whole. An important context for these events to be placed on. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in discussing the possibility of war with Russia before his fateful visit to Sarajevo, declared that he would never countenance a war with Russia, because such a thing would result in either the downfall of the Austrian Habsburgs or the Russian Romanovs, or both. People say things all the time, and many of those things don't actually come true. But this statement of the Archduke's came true in a hauntingly abrupt manner. He looks like a psychic. The truth is, though, that empires rise and fall. The Ottomans, the terrifying scourge of Christian Europe, who waged war and took the children of the areas they conquered, descended into sort of a coddled existence through the great powers of Europe after 2 centuries of increasingly humiliating losses following their rout at the walls of Vienna in 1683. But although it was the Russian Tsar Nicholas I who referred to the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, the rot in the other great powers that would result in the downfall of Nicholas's descendant Nicholas II and the Habsburg dynasty was swept under the rug. Certainly, the Russian imperial government didn't see the end coming. Although the quote I said earlier from General Pyotr Wrangel showed that those a bit lower on the totem pole did see a serious problem developing around the leadership of the Russian Tsar. The maneuvering and obfuscations of the Russian embassy in Belgrade to push Serbia toward a war with Austria-Hungary equaled the eagerness of the Austrians to go to war, to crush those annoying little Slavs south along the Danube. Who could have predicted that such rot would cause empires to collapse? Who? Except everyone watching in hindsight. General Pyotr Wrangel, the son of a baron, a military leader of German descent who was born in what is now Lithuania, and, completely off topic, a descendant of the same African great-grandfather named Avram Petrovich Ganibal, whose military prowess was legendary and whose other descendants numbered Alexander Pushkin amongst them, lived through all of this. We're used to talking about the collapse of the Russian Imperial Empire through figures such as Lenin, Trotsky, of course, Tsar Nicholas II and his family, and Rasputin, but much more can be learned from studying those a little further down the food chain. And this is where we come to General Wrangel. Wrangel served in the Russo-Japanese War. After that, he helped put down rebellions in Siberia, and after that, he served with incredible distinction as he watched Russia's collapse during the First World War. Wrangel's bravery resulted in multiple awards of Russia's highest medal, the declaration of the Military Order of St. George. He was wounded, and it was during his recuperation that the Tsar was arrested and Imperial Russia ceased to exist. Wrangel's insights during this time are a fantastic illustration of what the situation looked like to someone living through it, and you can read them yourself in the book he wrote, which is titled Always with Honor, The Memoirs of General Wrangel. He wrote, "With the disappearance of the Tsar, the very idea of authority and all the age-old obligations vanished, and nothing could take the place of either in the minds of the Russian people. Wrangel reported anarchy amongst the military troops, slovenly behavior and assaults, and misbehavior everywhere. No one was able to bring the troops back under behavioral control. It was as though once the ingrained societal traditions of behavior were broken, there was no ability to fix them. Fixing these issues required trust, and the rot at the end of the Russian Empire was so fresh in their minds and had created so much anger and resentment that there was no trust with which to rebuild. Perhaps this is a historic issue current governments should understand better." Wrangel chose to resign, and initially the Kerensky government let him go. But this situation continued to snowball. In the Crimea, Wrangel was arrested. He escaped, and from that point on, he decided to fight against the communists seizing power in Russia. He fought first under Anton Denkin, whose march to Moscow was self-sabotaged when he was unable to control his troops. The populace along the roads turned against the White Army. Wrangel took control as commander-in-chief of the White forces in the Crimea on April 4th, 1920. Through strength of character, he was able to bring the forces under control and stop the lawlessness and pogroms that had become commonplace, but it was simply too late. On November 14th, 1920, Wrangel oversaw a mass evacuation of his forces across the Black Sea. He eventually ended up in the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, what is now modern-day Serbia. In the lead-up to World War I, Serbia and Russia had been quite close. Not only was Russian support instrumental in returning the Karađorđević family to the Serbian throne in 1903, a story we will definitely get into more detail later and which is briefly touched upon in our podcast about the lead-up to World War I. But the king of the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes himself had not only trained at a military institute in St. Petersburg and attended to the Russian imperial family. He'd hoped to marry the Grand Duchess Tatiana. Her brutal death affected him deeply. This led him to institute a pro-imperial Russia policy, and tens of thousands of Russians fleeing the revolution settled in his kingdom. It was not all based on the king's honor, however. If the Russians opposing the Bolsheviks were able to regain the country, King Alexander would benefit from a huge amount of power in the bargain. Wrangel and many other Russian refugees made Serbia their new home, and unlike the refugees in Paris and Vienna, who often became destitute and had to resort to things such as driving taxis to survive, those in Alexander's kingdom prospered. They helped rebuild and expand the kingdom and were welcomed. Russian schools and cultural institutions were encouraged. And it's a very important point to consider that although Wrangel himself was likely poisoned by the nascent Soviet state, and two of his successors in leadership were kidnapped and murdered, none of this took place on the soil of the kingdoms of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Now, Wrangel is certainly not unknown in the annals of Russo-Serbian history, nor are the effects of the Russian Revolution and Serbo-Russian relations exactly esoteric subjects. However, it's worth considering the parallels between the two historic events. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, and even if history is currently going through a phase of avant-garde, non-rhyming, free-form verse, the path to what occurs today wound its way through the events of the past. We should pay attention. That's it for today's special edition of History She Wrote on the current events incident, that dare not speak its name. Please read more, go back further, and for goodness sake, make sure you can find all these places on a map.